The Unsent Letter, Chapter 1. My mother, Margaret, was a woman who rarely spoke of her past, especially her life before she met my father. She was a practical, quiet woman, her focus always on the present, on raising her family, on the steady rhythm of everyday life. She carried a certain sadness in her eyes, a quiet melancholy that I noticed even as a child, but I never knew its source. Her life, as I understood it, was straightforward, a path she walked with quiet determination. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 80, it felt like the closing of a beloved book, a life lived fully and quietly. I'm Clara. I'm 60 years old now, a widow, my children grown. Sorting through my mother's belongings after her passing was a task filled with both sorrow and quiet remembrance. Her house was filled with the familiar, the scent of her lavender soap, the worn armchair where she read, the photographs capturing moments from our lives. It was a journey through her life, through the objects that had made up her world. In her old writing desk, a beautiful antique piece that had belonged to her own mother, I found bundles of letters, tied with ribbons, sorted neatly by sender and date. Letters from my father during their courtship, letters from family members, letters from friends. It was like reading a history of her relationships, a glimpse into the connections that had shaped her life. And then, tucked away in a hidden compartment at the very back of a deep drawer, I found a single, unopened letter. It was old, the envelope yellowed and brittle, the postmark faded, but still visible. It was addressed to someone I didn't know, a Mr. Thomas Sullivan, at an address in a town I had never heard of, a town called Port Willow, nestled somewhere in a remote, mountainous region. The return address was my mother's, from her address before she married my father. The postmark date was from the spring of 1965, over 55 years ago. Why was this letter unopened? Why was it addressed to someone I didn't know in a remote town? And why was it hidden away in a secret compartment? A sense of unease settled over me. My mother was meticulous about her correspondence. Every letter received, every letter sent, was carefully filed. An unsent, unopened letter, hidden away, felt significant, out of character for her. With trembling hands, I carefully opened the faded envelope. The paper inside was fragile, brittle with age. The handwriting was my mother's, younger, less steady than I knew. My dearest Thomas, the letter began. Thomas, not my father's name. My father's name was Robert. I don't know if I can send this. The words feel so heavy. The choice, it was agonizing. But I had to, for his sake, for everyone's sake. Port Willow, it is a beautiful place. Thomas, quiet, hidden away. The journey here, it felt like traveling to another world, a world where the rules are different. I came here, Thomas, because there was nowhere else to go. My family, they would not understand. The shame in 1965, an unmarried mother, it would have ruined me, ruined our family. I thought I could do it alone, raise him myself. But the reality, it is so much harder than I imagined. The isolation, the judgment, even here, in this quiet place. And his needs, they are more than I can provide. The people here, they have been kind in their own way. They helped me, they helped him. But I had to make a decision, Thomas, a difficult decision. A decision that breaks my heart into 1,000 pieces. I had to leave him here, in Port Willow, with people who can give him the life he deserves, a stable life, a life away from the shame, away from the struggles I face. He is safe, Thomas. He is loved. The hardest part was walking away, leaving him behind. The silence of the journey back, it was unbearable. Please, Thomas, understand. Understand why I did this. Understand the impossible choice I had to make. I couldn't raise him alone. Not now. Not in the circumstances. He is our son, Thomas. Our son. Born on April 12th, 1965. I had to give him up. But he is safe. Remember that. He is safe. I will always love him. Always carry him in my heart. Forgive me, Thomas. Forgive me for leaving him. Forgive me for not being strong enough. With a heart broken but resolute, Margaret. The letter slipped from my trembling fingers, fluttering onto the desk. My breath hitched, a sob caught in my throat. Port Willow, a remote, mountainous town. My mother, in 1965, an unmarried mother, a son, born on April 12th, 1965, the same day as my 25th birthday. Her impossible choice, leaving him behind, giving him up. He's our son, Thomas. Thomas, the recipient of the letter. Not my father, Robert. My mother had a son with someone named Thomas, a son she had in secret in a remote town, a son she left behind. My half-brother, born on my 25th birthday, the shame. In 1965, an unmarried mother, the difficult circumstances. My mother, the quiet, reserved woman I knew, had carried this secret for over 50 years. A secret son, a heartbreaking choice, a life hidden away in a remote town. And the letter, unsent, unopened, a desperate plea to the father of her child, a plea she never sent, perhaps unable to bear the weight of her confession, perhaps unable to fully face the man who was also a part of this painful secret. Who was Thomas? The father of my half-brother, my mother's secret love. Where was he in 1965? Did he know about the baby? Did he ever receive a different message? Did he ever know about the son she left behind in Port Willow? And the son, my half-brother, born on April 12th, 1965, left behind in Port Willow. Who raised him? What kind of life did he have? Did he ever know about his mother? About her impossible choice? About the letter she wrote but never sent? The quiet sadness in my mother's eyes, the melancholy I had always sensed. It was the weight of the secret, the burden of her impossible choice, the enduring pain of leaving her son behind. My life, the life I had known, the clear narrative of my family history was suddenly shattered, revealing a hidden past, a secret child, a mother's heartbreaking sacrifice. The unsent letter, a fragile piece of paper, held the key to a lifetime of unspoken truths. To a branch of my family tree I never knew existed. Chapter 2.1. The unsent letter, a fragile relic from the past, had ripped open my understanding of my mother's life, revealing a secret son, a heartbreaking choice made in a remote town, and a lifetime of unspoken pain. My half-brother, born on my 25th birthday, left behind in Port Willow with people who could give him a better life than my mother. A young, unmarried woman facing the unforgiving judgment of 1965, felt capable of providing alone. And Thomas, the mysterious father to whom the desperate, unsent letter was addressed. His identity and his knowledge of his son's existence were also shrouded in the secrecy of the past. Who was Thomas? My mother's secret love, the father of my half-brother. Was he from Port Willow or somewhere else? Did he know about the pregnancy? Did he know about the son she left behind? The unsent letter suggested she was pouring out her heart to him, pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. This implied he was someone significant in her life, someone she felt compelled to confess to. And my half-brother, the baby born on April 12th, 1965, in Port Willow. Who raised him? Was he adopted by a local family? Did he grow up knowing he was adopted? Did he ever search for his biological mother? Did he ever wonder about the woman who gave him life and then seemingly walked away? The remote town of Port Willow held the answers. It was the place where my half-brother was born, the place where my mother made her agonizing choice, the place where his life began without her. I knew I had to go there to understand the circumstances, to find the people who took him in, to find any trace of my half-brother's life after my mother left. Port Willow was located in a mountainous region, a place described in the letter as quiet, hidden away, where the rules were different. The journey there was long, taking me away from the familiar landscapes of my life and into a remote, almost isolated community. As I drove closer, the roads narrowed, the mountains rose around me, and a sense of stepping back in time settled over me. Port Willow was a small, self-contained town, nestled in a valley, surrounded by towering trees. It felt untouched by the hurried pace of the modern world. The people I encountered were friendly, but their smiles held a certain reserve, a quiet curiosity about an outsider. This was a place where community bonds were strong, where everyone knew everyone, and where, I suspected, old secrets were guarded closely. I checked into the town's only guest house, a charming old building filled with the scent of wood smoke and history. The owner, a kind elderly woman named Martha, welcomed me with a worn smile, but her eyes held a question she didn't ask. I began my search subtly, visiting the town library and the local historical society. I looked for records from 1965, birth records, local newspapers, any mention of a young woman named Margaret, my mother's first name, being in town, any record of a baby born on April 12th. The records were limited. Birth records from that era were often kept private. The local newspaper from 1965 was thin, filled with local news and gossip, but nothing about an unmarried mother or a baby left behind. It seemed the secret had been well kept, even within this small community. I decided to try talking to older residents, people who might have been living in Port Willow in 1965. I visited the local general store, a hub of community life, and struck up conversations with people who had clearly lived there for many years. I mentioned my mother, Margaret, and her visit to Port Willow in 1965, saying I was trying to understand that period of her life. The mention of my mother's name from so long ago sparked some recognition, some vague memories. Some residents remembered a young woman named Margaret being in town for a while, but their recollections were hazy, offering no specific details about her circumstances or why she was there. There were hints of whispers, of a difficult situation, but no concrete information. One elderly man, sitting on the porch of the general store, His eyes, sharp and knowing, said, "Margaret Vance. Yes, I remember her. Pretty young woman. Came here for a spell. Difficult time, I reckon. Things were different back then. Not easy for a young woman on her own." Vance was my mother's maiden name. He remembered her name. "Did you know why she was here?" I asked gently. He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze assessing. He drew on his pipe, the smoke curling around his face. "Some things," he said slowly, "are best left in the past. This town, we look after our own, and some stories, they belong to the people who live them." His words were a clear message. The secret of my mother's time in Port Willow, the secret of her son, was known to some in this town, and they were not willing to share it easily with an outsider. The secrecy, the protectiveness of the community was both frustrating and intriguing. It confirmed that something significant had happened here, something the town was determined to keep hidden. It also suggested that the people who took my half-brother in were likely from this community, their identities protected by the town's code of silence. The unsent letter to Thomas remained a crucial clue. Who was he? Was he from Port Willow? Or was he the key to understanding my mother's life before she came here? Chapter 2.2. The silence of Port Willow's older residents was a formidable barrier, a clear indication that the secret of my mother's time there and the son she left behind was deeply embedded in the community's history, a truth protected by a collective code of silence. Their reluctance to speak confirmed that something significant, something that carried the weight of judgment and discretion from 1965, had indeed happened. The unsent letter to Thomas remained my most tangible clue to understanding my mother's emotional state and the circumstances surrounding her agonizing decision. The fact that she wrote it, pouring out her heart to him, but never sent it, spoke volumes about her internal conflict, her fear, and perhaps her unresolved feelings for the man who was the father of her child. Who was Thomas? Was he from Port Willow, or was he connected to my mother's life before she came to this remote town? His name, Thomas Sullivan, was the same as my late husband's first name and a common last name. It was difficult to trace him with just a name and a town address from 1965 on an unsent letter. I decided to focus my research on the context of 1965, the societal pressures faced by unmarried mothers, and the options available to them. In the 1960s, unmarried pregnancy was a significant social stigma. Many young women were sent away to live with relatives or in homes for unwed mothers to hide their condition and the subsequent birth. Adoption was often presented as the best or only option for the baby, a way to give the child a chance at a respectable life while protecting the mother and her family from shame. Remote towns like Port Willow might have offered a degree of anonymity, a place where a young woman could disappear temporarily to have her baby in secret. The phrase in my mother's letter, "The people here, they have been kind in their own way. They helped me, they helped him," suggested that she received assistance from individuals or perhaps an informal network within Port Willow. Who were these people? Were they involved in the arrangement to place her son? Were they the ones who raised him? I tried to find information about any homes for unwed mothers or adoption agencies that might have been active in or connected to the Port Willow area in 1965. The records were scarce and often protected by privacy laws. My search for Thomas Sullivan, the father, was equally challenging. I tried to find records of anyone named Thomas Sullivan who had a connection to my mother's life or to Port Willow in 1965. Was he a boyfriend from her hometown? Someone she met in Port Willow? Without more information, it was like searching for a needle in a haystack. The unsent letter itself held clues, not just in its words, but in its physical state. The fact that it was written but not sent, hidden away, suggested my mother's deep emotional turmoil. It was a confession, a plea for understanding, a message she desperately wanted to send but couldn't. Perhaps she was afraid of his reaction, afraid of the consequences of revealing the truth, afraid of disrupting his life, or afraid of facing him after making such a difficult choice on her own. The date on the letter, the postmark from Port Willow in 1965, confirmed her presence there. The content confirmed the birth of a son and her decision to leave him behind. But the details of who took him in, the circumstances of his upbringing, and the identity of his father remained largely a mystery, deliberately concealed by my mother and the people in Port Willow who helped her. I decided to take a different approach. Instead of focusing solely on official records, I would try to find someone in Port Willow who was known for knowing the town's history, someone who might have been a child or young adult in 1965, someone who might have heard whispers, seen things, someone whose memory, while not perfect, might hold a key to unlocking the past. I sought out the town's unofficial historian, an elderly woman named Agnes, known for her sharp memory and her encyclopedic knowledge of Port Willow's families and their stories. Agnes was initially as reserved as the others, reluctant to speak of old secrets. But as I shared the story of the unsent letter, of my mother Margaret Vance, of her time in Port Willow in 1965, a flicker of recognition appeared in her eyes. "Margaret Vance," Agnes said softly, her gaze distant. "Yes, I remember her, a quiet young woman, kept to herself. There was talk, of course, whispers. In a small town like this, secrets are hard to keep completely hidden." "There was a baby," I said gently, "her son, born here, in Port Willow, in 1965. She had to leave him behind." Agnes was silent for a long moment, looking out the window at the towering trees that surrounded the town. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "There was a baby. A little boy, born that spring. A secret everyone knew, but no one spoke of. It was a difficult time. For the young woman, for the town." "Who took him in, Agnes?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Who raised him? Was it a local family?" Agnes hesitated, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and discretion. "He was taken in," she said, choosing her words carefully, "by a good family, a family who loved him. They gave him a good life, a life free from the judgment, the hardship his mother faced." "Do you know their name?" I urged. "The name of the family who raised him?" Agnes looked at me, her gaze steady. "Some secrets," she said softly, echoing the words of the old man at the general store, "are not ours to tell. The boy, he was given a chance at a new life, a life away from the past. His story, it belongs to him now." Her words were a gentle refusal, a confirmation that the town was still protecting the secret, protecting the identity of the family who raised my half-brother. It was frustrating, but I also understood the motivation, the desire to shield the past, to protect the lives that had been built on a foundation of secrecy and difficult choices. But I had a right to know. My half-brother had a right to know. The truth, however difficult, deserved to be brought into the light. Chapter 3.1 Agnes's reluctance to reveal the identity of the family who raised my half-brother in Port Willow was a testament to the strength of the town's code of silence, a code designed to protect the secret lives woven into the fabric of their community. It was frustrating, but it also confirmed that my half-brother had indeed been raised locally within this quiet, remote town by a family who had taken him in and loved him. The unsent letter to Thomas, the father, remained a crucial but incomplete piece of the puzzle. If Thomas was from Port Willow, his name and connection to my mother might be found within the town's history. If he was from elsewhere, the challenge of finding him and understanding his side of the story was immense. I decided to shift my focus to uncovering the identity of Thomas Sullivan. My mother's intense emotional outpouring in the unsent letter suggested a deep connection to him, a shared history, a reason why she felt compelled to confess her difficult choice to him, even if she couldn't bring herself to send the letter. I began researching the Sullivan family name in Port Willow and the surrounding areas. Was there a prominent Sullivan family in the town in the 1960s? A family that might have known my mother, might have been connected to the events of 1965? The Historical Society's records offered some information about the families who had lived in Port Willow for generations. The Sullivan name was present in the town's history, a family with roots in the lumber industry that had once been the town's lifeblood. There were several Thomas Sullivans in the family tree, making it difficult to pinpoint the specific one my mother wrote to. I also revisited my mother's life before Port Willow, looking for any connections to a Thomas Sullivan. Were there any mentions of a significant relationship with a Thomas in her early letters or diaries, those from before 1965? My mother's early life as I knew it was simple, focused on her family and studies. There was no obvious mention of a serious relationship with someone named Thomas before she met my father, Robert. Secrecy surrounding her time in Port Willow, the period before she met my father, felt increasingly significant. It was as if her life in Port Willow and the events that occurred there were a separate, hidden chapter she had deliberately closed off from the rest of her life. I decided to try a different approach in Port Willow. Instead of asking direct questions about the baby or the family who raised him, I would try to learn more about the notable families in the town in 1965, particularly the Sullivan family, and see if any stories or connections emerged that might shed light on my mother's presence in the town or her relationship with a Thomas Sullivan. I spent time in the local library reading old town histories, articles about the prominent families, the businesses that shaped Port Willow. The Sullivan family was indeed well established, involved in the lumber mill that was the heart of the town's economy. I also subtly inquired about the Sullivan family from older residents, asking about their history, their connections in the town. I learned about different branches of the family, about individuals who were around in the 1960s. One name kept recurring in conversations: Thomas Sullivan Jr., the son of the owner of the lumber mill, a young man who was reportedly popular and well-liked in the town. His age would have aligned with my mother's age in 1965. Could Thomas Sullivan Jr. be the Thomas my mother wrote to? Could he be the father of my half-brother? His family's prominence in the town could explain the lengths to which the community went to protect the secret. A scandal involving the son of the mill owner an unmarried mother, a child born out of wedlock. That would have had significant repercussions in a small town like Port Willow in 1965. The possibility felt chillingly real. My mother, a young woman from out of town, forms a relationship with the son of the town's most prominent family, an unplanned pregnancy. The pressure to keep it secret, to avoid a scandal that would affect not just my mother, but also the respected Sullivan family. Port Willow, a remote location, a place to hide the pregnancy. The baby is born. The difficult choice is made. The baby is left behind, perhaps with a trusted family in the town, to protect the reputation of the father and his family. The unsent letter to Thomas Sullivan Jr., a desperate plea for understanding from the mother of his child. A letter she couldn't bring herself to send, carrying the burden of her secret alone. The narrative was taking shape, a story of secret love, societal pressure, a heartbreaking choice, and a community's conspiracy of silence to protect one of their own. Chapter 3.2. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly fitting together, forming a picture of a secret intertwined with the prominent Sullivan family of Port Willow. Thomas Sullivan Jr., the son of the mill owner, emerged as the likely recipient of my mother's unsent letter, the probable father of my half-brother. His family's standing in the community could explain the lengths to which the town went to protect the secret of the baby's birth and my mother's presence in 1965. But this was still speculation, albeit speculation based on compelling circumstantial evidence. I needed to find more concrete proof, something that directly linked my mother, Margaret Vance, to Thomas Sullivan Jr., and to the events of 1965 in a way that confirmed their relationship and the secret of their child. I decided to try and find any living relatives of Thomas Sullivan Jr. who might have known about his life in the 1960s, about any relationships he had, about any secrets he might have carried. The Historical Society and online genealogical databases provided information about Thomas Sullivan Jr.'s family tree. He had siblings, cousins, and later, a wife and children. Many of his contemporaries were likely gone, but some younger relatives might still be alive, living in or around Port Willow. I also sought out older residents who had known the Sullivan family well, hoping to find someone who might have been close enough to Thomas Sullivan Jr. in 1965 to know about his personal life, about any young women he was involved with. Approaching these individuals was a delicate process. I was asking about a man's private life from over 50 years ago, hinting at a potential secret that could be deeply unsettling for his family. I presented myself as someone researching my mother's history in Port Willow, her connections there, hoping to understand a period of her life that was a bit of a mystery to me. I spoke with several older residents, their memories often fragmented, their responses cautious. Some remembered Thomas Sullivan Jr. as a charming young man, popular with the ladies. They spoke of his later marriage, his life in the town. But no one openly mentioned any relationship he had with a young woman from out of town in 1965. Then I spoke with a retired mill worker, a man named Frank, who had worked for the Sullivan family for many years. Frank was in his 80s, his memory sharp, his demeanor straightforward. When I mentioned my mother, Margaret Vance, and her time in Port Willow in 1965, a knowing look appeared in his eyes. "Margaret Vance," Frank said, his voice low. "Yes, I remember her. Pretty young woman, kept to herself mostly. There was talk, of course, about her and young Thomas Sullivan Jr. My heart leaped. He knew. He knew about my mother and Thomas Sullivan Jr. They were involved, I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Frank nodded slowly. Aye, he said. They were quiet-like, didn't want the old man to know. Mr. Sullivan was a proud man, had plans for young Thomas, didn't want anything to mess that up. You confirm that their relationship was a secret, hidden from Thomas Sullivan Sr. and the rest of the prominent Sullivan family. It was clear that their relationship was considered a potential problem, a threat to the family's plans for Thomas Jr. There was talk, Frank continued, his voice lower now, that she was in a certain condition. When she left, that young Thomas, he was the father. He confirmed the pregnancy, the secret pregnancy of my mother, Margaret Vance, with Thomas Sullivan Jr. And the baby? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What happened to the baby? Frank looked away, his gaze distant, filled with the quiet sadness of old memories. The baby, he said. Yes, there was a baby, born that spring. A boy. It was kept quiet, very quiet. The Sullivan family, they made sure of that, didn't want the scandal. He confirmed the birth of a boy, my half-brother, born in Port Willow in 1965. And the Sullivan family's involvement in keeping it a secret. He was taken in, Frank said, choosing his words carefully, by a family here, a good family, trusted by the Sullivans, raised as their own. Away from the talk, the difficulty. He confirmed that my half-brother was raised in Port Willow by a local family, a family connected to the Sullivans. Do you know the name of the family who raised him? I asked, the question hanging in the air, thick with decades of unspoken history. Frank hesitated, his gaze returning to mine. He saw the earnestness in my eyes, the desperate need for answers. He sighed, a long, weary sound. The boy, he said, he's grown now. Lived his life here. A good man. Doesn't know the truth, I don't think, about his real parents. About the secret. He was still protecting the secret, protecting my half-brother from a truth that might disrupt his life. But he also seemed to understand my need to know. The family who raised him, Frank said, his voice quiet. It was the Davises, a good family, solid. The boy, he grew up here, still lives here, runs the hardware store now. Thomas Davis. Thomas. My half-brother's name was Thomas, the same name as his biological father, and his last name was Davis, the name of the family who raised him. My last name. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a force that left me breathless. Thomas Davis, raised in Port Willow, born in 1965. His age would align with my half-brother's birth date. My last name was Davis. Was the Davis family who raised my half-brother related to my father's side of the family? Or was it a coincidence of names? The unsent letter to Thomas Sullivan Jr., a desperate confession from my mother about the son she had to leave behind. The baby boy, their son, born in Port Willow in 1965, raised in secret by the Davis family, and named Thomas Davis, my half-brother. Chapter 4.1. The revelation that my half-brother was likely Thomas Davis, a man living in Port Willow, running the local hardware store, the son of the Davis family who raised him, a family trusted by the Sullivans, was a monumental step in uncovering the truth. the name Thomas, shared with his biological father, and the last name Davis, shared with me, added layers of irony and poignant connection to a story already rich with hidden history. My task now was to find Thomas Davis and, with immense sensitivity and care, approach him with the astonishing truth of his origins. He had lived his entire life believing the Davises who raised him were his biological parents, unaware of the secrets surrounding his birth, unaware that his biological father was the son of the town's most prominent family, and his biological mother was a young woman from out of town named Margaret Vance. Approaching Thomas Davis required careful consideration. I couldn't just walk into the hardware store and drop a bombshell that would shatter his understanding of his entire life. I needed to find a way to connect with him, to share the truth in a way that was gentle, respectful, and allowed him to process the information in his own time, in his own way. I decided to observe him first, to get a sense of the man he was, the life he had built in Port Willow. I visited the hardware store, posing as a customer, buying small items, watching him interact with the community. He was a kind man with a quiet demeanor, respected in the town, clearly a valued member of the community. He had a family. His wife worked in the store, and I saw photographs of grown children and grandchildren on his desk. He had built a good life, a stable life, the kind of life my mother, in her agonizing choice, had hoped he would have. The thought of disrupting this life, of introducing a truth that could bring pain and confusion, weighed heavily on me. But the truth deserved to be known. Thomas had a right to know about his biological parents, about the circumstances of his birth, about the choices made by others that had shaped his life. I decided to write him a letter first, similar to the approach I had taken in previous stages of my search. A letter that would introduce myself, explain my connection to Margaret Vance and her time in Port Willow in 1965, and gently introduce the possibility of a shared, hidden history. I wrote the letter carefully, choosing my words with immense sensitivity. I introduced myself as Clara Davis, a woman researching her mother, Margaret Vance's history in Port Willow in 1965. I explained that my mother had spent some time in the town that spring, and that through old family documents, I had uncovered information about a baby boy born in Port Willow on April 12, 1965, who was placed with a local family. I explained that my research suggested he might be that baby, and that my mother was his biological mother. I mentioned the name of his likely biological father, Thomas Sullivan Jr. I included copies of my mother's unsent letter, the postmark from Port Willow, and the information from Frank, the retired mill worker, about the Davis family raising the baby. I emphasized that I was not seeking to disrupt his life, only to share a truth that had been hidden for a long time, to honor the lives involved, and to connect with a hidden part of our family history, if he was open to it. I included my contact information. Sending the letter was an act of faith, a release of the truth into the world, knowing that it would have a profound impact on Thomas Davis's life and the lives of his family. The waiting period was filled with intense anxiety and anticipation. How would he react? Would he believe me? Would he be angry? Or would he be open to hearing about a past he never knew existed? Then, one evening, as dusk was settling over my quiet suburban neighborhood, a car pulled into my driveway. I looked out the window, my heart pounding. A man got out of the car, older now, but with a resemblance that was undeniable. a resemblance to the young man in the photographs of Thomas Sullivan Jr., a resemblance that also hinted at a connection to the quiet woman who was my mother, Margaret Vance. It was Thomas Davis, Chapter 4.2. Seeing Thomas Davis standing on my doorstep, the man who was likely my half-brother, the baby left behind in Port Willow over 55 years ago, felt like a moment suspended in time. His face, lined with age, held a mixture of uncertainty and something else, a dawning recognition, perhaps, of a hidden truth beginning to surface. I opened the door, my voice trembling slightly. "Thomas?" I said. "Clara?" he replied, his voice quiet, hesitant. I received your letter. We sat in my living room, the unsent letter from my mother, the copies of the old documents lying on the coffee table between us. The air was thick with unspoken history, with the weight of a past that had been buried for decades, a past that was finally being brought into the light. Thomas was quiet at first, his gaze distant, absorbing the enormity of the information in my letter. He spoke of his life in Port Willow, growing up as Thomas Davis, the son of kind and loving parents who ran the hardware store. He had had a happy childhood, a stable upbringing, a life firmly rooted in the community. He had never suspected that the people who raised him were not his biological parents, that his life began with a secret, a difficult choice made by a young woman from out of town. I shared with him the story I had uncovered, my mother, Margaret Vance's time in Port Willow in 1965, her secret relationship with Thomas Sullivan Jr., the son of the mill owner, the shame of an out-of-wedlock pregnancy, her desperate choice to leave him behind, to give him a chance at a better life, the unsent letter, her lifelong sadness. I showed him the photographs of my mother as a young woman, of Thomas Sullivan Jr., the likely biological father. Thomas listened, his face a mask of disbelief and profound sadness. Tears welled up in his eyes as he learned about the woman who gave him life, about the impossible choice she made, about the love and pain expressed in the letter she never sent. "My parents," he said softly, referring to the Davises who raised him. "They never said a word, never hinted at any of this." It was clear that the Davises had kept the secret, honoring the arrangement made with my mother and the Sullivan family, raising Thomas as their own, protecting him from a truth they believed would cause him pain or disrupt his life. "They were good people, Clara," Thomas said, his voice filled with emotion. "They gave me a good life, a life filled with love." He was not angry at the Davises for the deception. He understood intellectually the context of the time, the desire to protect him, to give him a stable home. His love and gratitude for the parents who raised him were unwavering. The revelation of his biological father, Thomas Sullivan Jr., was also a lot to process. The son of the prominent family in town, the man who had seemingly walked away from his responsibility, leaving my mother to face the consequences alone, a man who had gone on to live his life, perhaps unaware of the son he had fathered, or perhaps choosing to remain silent to protect his family's reputation. Thomas expressed a mix of curiosity and a quiet sadness about his biological father, a man he never knew, a man whose life was so intertwined with the secret of his own birth. We talked for hours that evening, two strangers, bound by a shared, hidden history, a history that was finally being brought into the light. We were half-siblings, connected by blood and by the intricate web of choices and secrets that had shaped our lives. Thomas took the unsent letter from my mother, holding it gently in his hands, a tangible link to the woman who gave him life, the woman who carried the burden of her choice and her secret for over 50 years. It was a gift, a heartbreaking gift, but a gift that provided him with answers, with a piece of his identity that had been missing for a lifetime. The next few weeks were a blur of emotional processing, of sharing the truth with our respective families, Thomas with his children and grandchildren, me with mine. The revelations were met with shock, with sadness, but also with a sense of understanding and a newfound appreciation for the complex history of our family. Thomas and I began building a relationship, a connection forged in the crucible of this shared secret. We were half-siblings, brought together by an unsent letter and a relentless search for truth. We talked about our mother, Margaret, about the woman we both knew in different ways, about the quiet sadness she carried, a sadness we now understood. We honored her memory, acknowledging the impossible choice she had made, the love and pain she had carried in silence. The unsent letter, a symbol of a secret kept, became a catalyst for connection, for understanding, or a family finding its way back to a form of wholeness, embracing the hidden branches of our tree, the lives that were lived in the shadows, and the truths that were finally being brought into the light. Chapter 5.1: The journey that began with an unsent letter hidden in my mother's desk had led me down a path of uncovering a complex, multi-generational family secret, a story of a young woman's love and loss, an impossible choice made in a remote town, and the life of a son she left behind. Finding my half-brother, Thomas Davis, the man who was once the baby left behind in Port Willow, and connecting with him as family, brought a profound sense of purpose and resolution to my own life. Thomas, now in his 60s, was integrating the truth of his origins into the narrative of his life. He had a loving family, a successful career, a life filled with meaning. The knowledge that the Davises who raised him were not his biological parents didn't diminish his love for them or the life they had given him. It added layers of complexity. Forged in the crucible of this shared secret and the journey of discovery had grown into a unique and meaningful connection. We were half-siblings, brought together by an unsent letter and a relentless search for truth. We talked about our mother, about the woman we both knew in different ways, about the quiet sadness she carried, a sadness we now understood. We honored her memory, acknowledging the impossible choice she had made, the love and pain she had carried in silence. The story of Thomas Sullivan Jr., the likely biological father, remained a part of the narrative, a reminder of the complex web of relationships and choices that shaped our lives. His family, the prominent Sullivans of Port Willow, had played a role in the cover-up, in the decision to keep the baby's birth a secret, to protect the family name. While understanding the historical context, the societal pressures of the time, the impact of their actions on my mother's life and on Thomas's origins was undeniable. The unsent letter, a symbol of a secret kept, became a catalyst for connection, for understanding, for a family finding its way back to a form of wholeness, embracing the hidden branches of our tree, the lives that were lived in the shadows, and the truths that were finally being brought into the light. Thomas and I were two halves of a story, brought together by a mother's unspoken pain and a daughter's search for answers. The remote town of Port Willow, once a place of mystery and hidden secrets, became a place of connection and understanding. We visited the town together, Thomas and I, walking the streets, seeing the places where his life began, where our mother made her agonizing choice. We met some of the older residents, the ones who had known my mother, who had known about the baby, who had kept the secret for so long. There was a sense of quiet acknowledgement, of shared history, of a community grappling with its own past and the impact of its collective silence. The unsent letter, a fragile piece of paper that had lain hidden for over 55 years, had fulfilled its purpose, not in delivering a message to Thomas Sullivan Jr., but in revealing a truth that spanned generations, connecting two lives that were meant to be connected, and bringing a sense of peace and understanding to a story that had been shrouded in secrecy for too long. My life, which began with a mother's quiet sadness and a hidden letter, had been profoundly changed. I had uncovered a hidden branch of my family tree, connected with a half-brother I never knew existed, and gained a deeper understanding of the intricate ways lives are shaped by love, loss, secrets, and the unpredictable hand of fate. The unsent letter, a testament to a mother's pain and love, had ultimately brought two siblings together, two halves of a story finally united, a reminder that even when messages are lost, truth has a way of finding its way, weaving together the fragmented pieces of the past into a tapestry of connection and understanding in the present. Chapter 5.2, the journey sparked by the unsent letter, had profoundly reshaped my understanding of my family's history and my place within it. Finding my half-brother, Thomas Davis, the man who was the baby left behind in Port Willow, and building a relationship with him, brought a sense of completeness to a story that had been shrouded in secrecy for over 55 years. Thomas, now in his 60s, was navigating the complex emotions of discovering his true origins. He loved the parents who raised him, the Davises of Port Willow, with an unwavering devotion. The knowledge that they were not his biological parents didn't diminish his gratitude or his love for them. It simply added a layer of understanding to the unique bond they shared. He was also processing the story of his biological mother, Margaret Vance, my mother, the woman who had carried him, given birth to him, and then made the heartbreaking choice to leave him behind, to give him a chance at a life she felt unable to provide alone. The unsent letter, a tangible piece of her pain and love, was a precious link to her, a window into the impossible choice she faced. Our relationship, as half-siblings, was new, but it was rooted in a shared history that ran deeper than a lifetime. We were two halves of a story, brought together by a mother's secret and a daughter's relentless search for truth. We spent time together, sharing stories of our lives, of the mother we both knew in different ways, of the paths our lives had taken. There was a sense of finding a missing piece, of a puzzle finally completed. The story of Thomas Sullivan Jr., the likely biological father, remained a part of the narrative. A complex figure in a story woven with difficult choices and societal pressures. His family's role in the cover-up, in ensuring the secret remained buried to protect their reputation, highlighted the unforgiving nature of the past and the lengths to which people would go to avoid scandal. Port Willow, the remote town that had held the secret for so long, became a place of connection and understanding. We visited the town together, Thomas and I, walking the streets, seeing the places where his life began, where our mother made her agonizing choice. We met some of the older residents, the ones who had known our mother, who had known about the baby, who had kept the secret for so long. There was a sense of quiet acknowledgement, of shared history, of a community grappling with its own past and the impact of its collective silence. The unsent letter, a fragile piece of paper that had lain hidden for over 55 years, had fulfilled its purpose, not in delivering a message to Thomas Sullivan Jr., but in revealing a truth that spanned generations, connecting two lives that were meant to be connected, and bringing a sense of peace and understanding to a story that had been shrouded in secrecy for too long. It was a testament to my mother's enduring love and her unspoken pain, a legacy carried in silence and finally brought into the light. My life, which began with a mother's quiet sadness and a hidden letter, had been profoundly changed. I had uncovered a hidden branch of my family tree, connected with a half-brother I never knew existed, and gained a deeper understanding of the intricate ways lives are shaped by love, loss, secrets, and the unpredictable hand of fate. The unsent letter, a testament to a mother's pain and love, had ultimately brought two siblings together, two halves of a story finally united. A reminder that even when messages are lost, truth has a way of finding its way, weaving together the fragmented pieces of the past into a tapestry of connection and understanding in the present. The secret, once a shadow over our family, was now a shared history, a bond that connected us, two siblings brought together by the enduring power of a mother's love and the unexpected journey sparked by an unsent letter.